On the panel is Hugo James. He's the managing partner at NSSIF. Then we have Clayton Williams, who you met yesterday. He's the managing director of In-Q-Tel International. Then we have Patrick Schneider-Sikorsky, partner at NIF. And finally, we have Nabil Ben Mahdi, business development manager at the European Investment Fund. And moderating this panel is a former TechCrunch colleague of mine, Ingrid Lunden, European editor at TechCrunch. Give him a round of applause and bring him on out.
Okay, thanks so much for coming and doing this panel towards the very end of the conference. So it's great to have you guys here. So listen, we've got I want to just go straight into this, but I have primed you guys on the first question I'm going to ask you, because I think it's kind of important because you're coming from 4 totally different organizations. So I'd love to know if you guys could just do the kind of like 1-minute elevator pitch for how your organization, your government organization, invests in startups. And you can kind of take that however you want. You can answer, how do we do it, or what do we do, or what do we wish we did? We can start with you, Hugo, since you're at the very end.
Yes, thanks very much. So NSSIF, in short, it's the government's corporate venturing arm for national security and defence. We have one overarching mission, which is really to accelerate the adoption and the understanding of advanced capability into the national security and defence community. We do that really with a hybrid model. So we operate a fund-of-funds strategy. We have a direct investment vehicle. We run R&D with companies to enhance and adapt and modify their product. And we also run an insight program. So we're always collecting information from the market, passing that back into government so that we understand where the bleeding edge is, and we can make more informed procurement and acquisition decisions. So that's us in a nutshell.
Cool, thank you. Nabil.
Thank you. Well, the European Investment Fund is part of the European Investment Bank group, which is basically the financial arm of the European Union. And very roughly, what we are doing is that we are translating EU policies into financial mechanisms in order to cater for those policies. So at the EIF, we focus on startups and SMEs that we see as the backbone of the EU economy. And the way we, to get into today's subject, the way we tackle thematics such as defense is that we start with a pilot. Usually it's an equity pilot. The bulk of our investments are done through intermediaries, VC and private equity funds that will in turn target SMEs and startups. So we start with a small pilot, and then we try to scale it up as much as possible, also depending on the funds that we are able to raise for that particular thematic.
Thank you. Patrick.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm a partner of the NATO Innovation Fund. It's a 1.04 billion euro fund set up by NATO, backed by 24 NATO allies, to invest in deep technologies, strategic technologies for dual use that can be applied to defense, security, and resilience. We were set up a year ago. We've started investing this year. And in addition to investing in commercially successful dual-use startups, one of our main missions is adoption as well as capacity building across the alliance.
Okay. We'll get back to that actually in a bit with the adoption thing.
Clayton Williams from In-Q-Tel. We're 25 years old. We were founded by the CIA in the US. We now represent over a dozen agencies within the US intelligence community, the UK government, and the Australian government as well. We're actually a not-for-profit, so we're not government, we're not-for-profit. And we are solely focused on identifying, adapting, and delivering technology into our government customers' hands.
Cool, very, very good, thank you. So listen, one of the big things for VCs when they invest in startups is deal flow. And you know, the process of how they figure out what it is that they should be investing in. You've got, scouts out there, you've got very large firms with whole scouting networks. You've got people who are building like massive AI databases to, literally read the internet to figure out who they should be investing in, et cetera, et cetera. You've got, obviously VCs who are, apparently, geniuses at just divining who to invest in. So How do you guys do deal flow? How do you guys find who you should be investing in? Do you do it straight by inbound and then triage what you get, or what? Any of you can answer this question. I'd love to hear from any of you on it.
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you start? Yeah.
Yeah, we have a team, a tech diligence team at In-Q-Tel that's about 30 PhDs that look after cybersecurity or quantum or whatever it might be. And so our kind of network or syndicate of co-investors often reach out to us with deal flow because we can provide pretty good tech diligence.
Are they other VC firms, or are
yeah,
they?
Typically.
Yeah, right. So not individual, not angels or
could be.
scouts. Okay.
Yeah, it could be, and we're stage agnostic. So if it's really early stage, it's usually an angel. If it's late stage, it's a growth fund.
And do they apply to you to do that, or do you reach out and you find someone who you like the look of, and you say, yeah?
Yeah, we talk to over 1,000 new companies every year.
Right.
So it's a lot of sorting the stack, but we have pretty good coverage. I think Europe, Asia is a little bit tougher. We have smaller teams internationally.
Right. Actually, Patrick, why don't you tell me, since you guys are, I think, the newest of all of us
Yes,
here.
yes.
So
I mean,
you can go on all the learnings of other companies.
well,
So
like In-Q-Tel, we have a network of co-investors, other VCs, angels. We, including In-Q-Tel and NSSIF. We also have a fund of funds program. So we invest in funds across Europe, across those 24 countries. So we get deal flow from our portfolio funds.
Yeah.
We also get we have 24 sovereign governments as our LPs, and they have their own. A lot of them have their own national funds. They work with their local VC ecosystems, so we get a lot of inbound from that. Yeah, I mean, we've looked at, not to be competitive, but we looked at 1,600 deals.
Oh, there you go.
Year, so.
You got some catching up to do.
Okay, and what about, either of you want to answer that?
I might
How
just
you're gonna-
jump in on that point, because I think
Yeah.
the challenge in the market is not supply. Innovators will innovate, that will always
Yeah,
happen. And
especially
there's-
these days.
Exactly,
Yeah.
there is a myriad of entrepreneurial activity
Absolutely.
always happening.
Yeah.
The challenge for governments is very much demand. So what are we interested in? How do we communicate that out to the market? And that is one of the reasons, I suppose, most of our respective organizations have been created, is to try and channel that demand, communicate what our interests are into the market, and the market can hopefully respond. And one of the reasons why NSSIF was created and focused on the venture community, because that is a world that exists on relationships and is built on trust. And I think that is one of the most powerful things we can deliver into the market, is this ability to really trust what we're saying as a kind of validated demand signal.
Yeah.
And entrepreneurs can then mobilize around those and start building technology.
Nabil, how are you guys making yourselves? I mean, you're largely doing indirect investing, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. We're in
Yeah.
a slightly different realm. So from an LP perspective, and for instance, again, in relation to the topic of today, defense, when we look at a thematic such as defense, and we did something similar for space, we try to sort of build the ecosystem in the sense that we are going to try to provide funding to VCs that are going to be fully dedicated to the thematic or partially dedicated. And what we want to do is to send a signaling effect to the market in order to act as an in-core investor and sort of catalyze more on private investment and maximize our firepower and make the most out of our mandate, which is not huge. And from a company level, we also have advisory activities that we usually don't lead, but we have partners such as the European Commission, and we also try to interact with companies and promote interactions between investors and companies.
Do you ever feel like you would be better serving, I don't know, your stakeholders if you were being able to make direct investments in startups, though? I mean, it sort of feels a bit powerless in a way. You're sort of relying on other parties to make good decisions on your behalf.
Well, it has the advantage of being able to enlarge our reach, because for €1 that we put in a VC fund, it will translate into at least 2 to 3 or 4 euros in the final benefit. Well, for SMEs as a whole, so that's an advantage. And we can actually do direct investments, but it's not the core of our business. We do it on an opportunistic basis, and we usually do it with a portfolio fund. So whenever an opportunity comes up through a fund that we know well, then we might come in and match their investments in order to potential scenarios where when a company wants to is on the fringe of being acquired by outside EU, that type of thing.
So,
Can I just jump in there? Because I think
Yeah.
I think institutions like the EIF have a huge effect on the European venture ecosystem, and so
AI?
EIF.
Yeah, sorry.
So they're crowding in capital and they're building capacity across
Yeah.
Europe, and so in some ways, you can have. I guess it depends. It depends on the scale, but the level of impact they have by creating new funds actually helps us as investors as well.
Right,
So.
because it just lays the groundwork of a baseline of funding that's there to tap for building the bigger rounds.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have some questions about that as well. But before I do that, something you brought up about how you're sourcing deal flow. You mentioned like a really wide range of stakeholders there.
Yeah.
From countries through to NATO itself, through to VCs you work with, and so on and so forth, and scouts. How are you? Do you ever come up against really, really strong conflicts of interest between all of those different people? I mean, and how do you guys resolve that?
In what
Well,
sense?
if you've got different countries, not everyone is always on the same page. You have different priorities from different people, different places. And
Yes,
how do you resolve
well,
that?
I think
I think that when you think about a VC, I keep talking about VCs, but they are the kind of the comparative thing where you have LPs who have some influence, but ultimately hand over some money and then let the partners make the choices. Is it following the same, or do you have to somehow answer to the stakeholders in a more fundamental way?
No, I mean, I think the LPs have entrusted us to make all the investment decisions, and so they, of course, countries have their own national interests, but that doesn't factor into our day-to-day operations. So, yeah, I mean, they've all signed up for our mission, and so they let us do our job. Obviously, they're happy if we come to their countries and look at investments there, but ultimately it's our decision, and we're investing in the best companies that align with our mission. So there's no interference.
Okay.
And maybe just to add to
Yes,
Patrick's comment there, so one of the benefits of using equity is it creates alignment. So going back to my trust point, the investors, the LPs, the GPs, they're all aligned because their interests very much focus on the financial outcomes. In the case of in our entities, they're focused on whatever the impacts are from those investments. So I think that's what we saw when we started undertaking investments, is that we were creating a much better baseline for building these long-term relationships and then hopefully wider impact through those.
Okay. So kind of want to shift the conversation a little to talking about this idea of dual use, or what the purpose is of like what your end game is, or your end goal is. It's been quite interesting because I think that at some point people thought about government investors as being very, very focused on, for example, national security or very directly national interests. I sort of feel like the conversation has evolved. I mean, even the name of this conference kind of says it all. Resilience, it's a really wide term. It can mean anything. It can mean, clean, alternative energy, or a military startup, or cybersecurity. How are you guys kind of viewing that investment thesis nowadays? What is your priority at like In-Q-Tel? I know you say you're a nonprofit and you sort of answer to a lot of different companies, organizations, although really I still think in my head it's very much more of a US focused
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, 95% of our funding comes from the US.
But, okay.
So we're very US focused. But I think the U.S. recognizes that they don't have an exclusivity on innovation.
Right.
Well,
you're here in London.
Correct. Yeah, and we invest about 15% of our portfolios outside of the United States.
Okay.
So
yeah,
but
dual use versus single use,
yeah,
and all that.
It's a bit of. We don't use the term defense tech. We don't use the term resilience tech. We use it. Global security is what we call it. But it's really. The technology is not usually that application specific. It's the customers who have specific uses for the technology. So we have companies that primarily service large enterprise commercial customers, but that's exactly the same use case that the government needs. And so if we can just adapt the product in some small way to make it usable by government, well, then it's an incredible money savings versus building a bespoke intelligence community solution. So we really try, I mean, it's a very expensive way to develop technology by going through a venture model. And so we try to show the value through the use of multiple markets to pay for the version 2.0 or 3.0.
Is that like a kind of part of something you build into looking at or evaluating companies that, I mean, I would think that what he's just said is probably the blueprint for how a lot of you guys operate. But let's say you get a company that has a very pure, it seems to have a very specific use case that's not as applicable across multiple scenarios. Is that a deal breaker? Are you looking for things that are inherently feel more extensible in that way?
Maybe I'll just jump in really quick, because it's actually pretpretty interesting. It comes to mind, I was looking at two different additive manufacturing companies a few years ago, and there was a clear market leader.
Which ones were they?
Off the record, we'll go off the record. We're comparing Desktop Metal and Markforged.
Okay.
And at the time, Desktop Metal had a more advanced product, and they had numerous applications that could be applied. But the software was very cloud-centric and kind of a mess to convert to government. And then we looked at Markforged that had a very similar technology, but had a much more streamlined offline capability. It was much easier to adapt, and they really cared and wanted to engage in the military market. So we invested in Markforged despite perhaps the more attractive venture returns that Desktop Metal would have. And it turns out it was a good decision either way, but I think they're both now acquired by an Israeli Nano Dimension recently in the news. But anyway, it's not always the market winner that's the impact winner for government.
Okay. Yeah. You guys have thoughts on that?
I mean,
yeah, Patrick.
I agree with that. But also on the flip side, I guess we want to invest in companies that are resilient for the long term, and that means that they're well funded and they're able to generate revenue and raise further rounds. Because a company that has a very specific application might not be able to stay in business for a very long time, and then they're not a good they're not going to provide a good long-term capability for government. So that's why we want to look at companies that can actually that can move between markets. It's not necessarily one or the other, or this first and then that second. It can go either way. But
I suppose that's no different from a normal VC, really.
Except we want companies that can be adopted by government.
That can be what?
That can be adopted by government. That's
right. Yeah. Hugo, are you looking at? I mean, are you looking for companies that have that kind of resilience to them as well, or are you looking for? I mean, you have in the name of NSSIF, has a very specific focus. Is that kind of your primary focus, would you say, or have you tried to evolve that?
I think that the public line is we're sector, stage, geographically agnostic. We want to invest in the best technology that's going to give our mission partners a competitive edge in the world that we live in. The happy byproduct of that is a lot of these technologies have massively addressable commercial markets. So if I think about our direct investment portfolio, there's quantum technologies in there, there's AI, there's additive manufacturing, and these are all technologies that the rest of the market is investing in. And going back to Clayton's point and Nabil's from earlier, is that we want to crowd capital into these technology areas that we see as critical not only for national security but wider economic growth, prosperity, and resilience.
Do you feel that there was a time when In-Q-Tel, I've written about tech for a while, and it was impenetrable. Your name would occasionally appear on things, sometimes it wouldn't, and then I would be told they're investing, and then I would write it, and I would be, please take it out of the article, please take it out, So, there's this absolute to and fro over what's secretive, what's not, etc. Yeah. These days, I would say that there's you're more likely to see the In-Q-Tel logo, as they as they say it, on things. How do your organizations feel about your names appearing as public backers of companies? Do you disclose all of them? I mean, I will say, like on the EIF's website, there is virtually nothing about what it is you guys do, and actually the same with NSSIF. You have a few examples. I think 2 examples on your site. I think you've invested in a lot more than 2 companies. How do you? Maybe one of you two can talk about that, since you're probably disclosing a lot less than these two are these days.
Yeah, I think it's improving. It's getting better. We have a security and defense office now at in the EAB group, and actually, if you look in our past investments before, we actually had a dedicated defense mandate. We invested in technologies that at some point became defense related. So I think it's an interesting era because now we have a dedicated mandate, but we already have experience in investing in that sort of technologies. So I would rather see it as from a journey perspective. Saying defense, mentioning investing in defense a few months, years back in the EIB group was obviously taboo, and now it's part of the 8 priorities. We have, I'm part of a thematic team, and I'm officially covering the subject of defense along with other colleagues, and we have a security and defense office, and we are going to roll out our mandates, and our investments are obviously going to be public. So yeah. It's obviously it comes down to dual use, our what we call defense, but it's a journey, and I think we are on track to make progress.
What about you, Hugo? Are you guys going to start being a little more public about what you're doing? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the ambition, as long as it's helpful and additive to those companies. And I think it's worth reflecting. We're less than 6 years old, so somewhat of a startup ourselves. But we invest out of a limited company. You can find the portfolio on Companies House if you want to go and look for that. So we're deliberately not trying to mislead anyone, but clearly we're representing national security and defense. We need to protect their interests. And ensure that the wider national security and defence capability is not vulnerable by the activities that we're undertaking. So, yes, the answer is we want to be more open and connected with the wider community, but only do so in a way that's not going to create any jeopardy for our customers.
So we don't have a lot of time. But I did want to talk about something about the opportunities for your startups. So. Now, I know that a lot of them are obviously serving much more than just government entities in terms of their target businesses. Let's just focus just on government deals, though, and deals that they can their deal flow into government organizations. Now, I know that with a lot of government services, they've got their primes, as they call them, the very big companies that are their main suppliers for different things. How is it that the smaller startups, are they getting a better look in, or is that a challenge still for them to actually connect with business within government organizations these days versus years back?
Yeah, I think the defense primes realize that they need to play in this market as well to stay relevant. Many of them have their own venture arms that are strategic investors that we co-invest alongside. It's very important when we make an investment, we understand how that technology could be adopted. If it's a widget that goes in a fighter pilot, cockpit, then you need to have Lockheed interested, or else you're not delivering it to a place that's effective. So that's something we spend a lot of time when we make an initial investment, is we envision if this is going to be wildly successful, what does the end state look like, and does that have meaning?
Is that getting easier, though? I'm assuming it must be, with more startups doing more.
It's not just, it's also on the government side to demand that they have open APIs, they have standards that they can build interfaces to, so that these startups can plug in to these kind of bespoke systems that have been built.
Yeah. Hugo, have you seen do you have thoughts about how that's working within the UK?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo Clayton's points, primes play a critical role within our ecosystem. They're called systems integrators for a reason. Clearly there is an imperative for them also to access the best technology in the market, and I think at the moment that is not going to change, and we work very hopefully collaboratively with our prime partners.
Patrick, I'd like to ask you a question before we end. With the fact that we've got so many massive events shaping our kind of thinking about things like defense tech these days, how much of that is informing where NATO targets its investments? Or are you trying to kind of ride above all of that and just make really what you believe are important tech investments? Or are they very much shaped by world events?
Well, I think we're shaped by short-term needs, obviously,
Yes.
but we also have to think for the long term because there have been massive geopolitical shifts recently, and that's affected how we
Your
decide.
very existence, I would think. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, so we were actually set up. We were conceived before Ukraine.
Okay.
But that's very much influenced some of our decision making. But then we also have to think long term. We have to be investing in long-term deep technologies that will provide a capability even in 10 or 15 years because our competitors are doing the same. So
Yes.
you kind of have to do both.
Yeah, okay. We have literally 4 seconds left, so I'm just going to say thank you so much to
Thank you.
all 4 of you. Thank you so much for those of you who came in to listen, so thanks.
Thank you.